Last year, you may have looked around your home and thought, well, since we can't go anywhere, it might be nice to do some home renovations. Maybe build that bigger deck or build that nice gazebo. Everything you've always wanted to finally create that nice backyard oasis. So you went over to the home improvement store and you were hit with a heavy dose of reality. The lumber alone for that project had set you back thousands of dollars. This is timber! Why lumber prices are on a wild ride.
I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I sleep all night and I work all day.
He's a lumberjack and he's okay. He sleeps all night and he works all day.
I cut down trees, I eat my lunch, I go to the laboratory.
Lumber plays a really important part in our industries, and particularly for a housing-obsessed country like Canada, it's essential. So in today's video, I want to discuss the North American lumber industry, why prices went wild during the pandemic, and why we're seeing the same surge just a few months ago. See, there's a reason why I'm dressed like a lumberjack today, or, as a Canadian, dressing normally. Well, anywho, it's about time we dug into this video. First of all, lumber was never a particularly cheap commodity, but in 2020 we saw quite a bit of price lift, and by 2021, lumber prices went utterly haywire. That year, lumber futures on the NASDAQ more than doubled from around $700 to $1,670 US. More specifically, it was a boost of 138%. For this, you can once again blame the pandemic-fueled run-up in housing, as Canadians were snatching up property like it was going out of style. With this came a ravenous demand for renovations. Even for people who already own homes, they also caught the renovation bug, since being locked down doesn't really give you that many places to go, and people wanted to make their home prisons a little nicer. The spike in demand could not have come at a worse time, as the pandemic forced lumber mills to close down operations and even caused labor shortages among the lumber mills that were open. This further caused a lot of cramps in an already seized up lumber supply chain. Lumber mills scrambled to get supply out the door, and darn right they were going to charge a premium on what little supply they did have. It's completely understandable why homeowners would want to improve their living situations, however it added more strain to contractors and added more cost to housing construction. A CBC report found that the cost of basic lumber has more than doubled since 2018, adding tens of thousands to the cost of constructing a new home. The contractors quoted in the piece estimate that for a typical 2,500 square foot home, the costs of lumber alone during its peak could run over $30,000. Even smaller townhomes could run builders $10,000 for lumber. A combination of high demand and pandemic-related supply chain snarls meant that the price of lumber stayed pretty elevated for most of 2021. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the rally in lumber priced out many would-be renovators, and the overall lumber supply was further aided by increased production in sawmills that were actually able to operate again. So it wouldn't be until late May, heading into June, that lumber futures were able to come back down again and consumer prices cooled off. Bloomberg figures that prices sunk by about 70% from May to late August as prices began to bottom out. This, of course, was very annoying for renovators who finished their projects at peak lumber prices, assuming that prices would only continue to go up. But hey, at least they got some lumber memes out of it. This one spelled out the end of high lumber prices during the pandemic, but I'll get into more detail on that later on in the video. Before we go on about lumber demand and prices, I should give a bit more background on this topic. Talking about the history of lumber in this country may sound dull on the face of it, but it actually has quite a few interesting developments. So, as with every country ever, lumber obviously has a very established history in Canada and was a crucial staple for lodging and infrastructure development dating back to the colonial era. Fast forward to recent years, and the country's top lumber companies by production and capacity are West Fraser, Canfor, Resolute, Tolko, and J.D. Irving. Another important thing to note about North America, not just Canada, is that there has always been a lumber supply problem even before the pandemic. This issue became particularly prominent as mountain pine beetles infested and destroyed about 18 million hectares of forest between the 1990s and 2017. These beetly boys also cleared about 50% of the commercial pine volume. It's also estimated that these beetly boys cleared about 752 million cubic meters of sellable pine, according to the Canadian Forest Service. Western provinces and some states in the US would continue to grapple with this pine beetle problem, especially as climate change began heating up these biomes and allowed these beetles to last for a longer time instead of being taken out by a harsh winter. This has prompted lower supply for Canadians and has pushed Americans to rely further on Canadian lumber supply. This brings me to the next major development in the Canadian lumber trade that we should know for background here. The softwood lumber trade dispute between Canada and the US has been one of the longest, most enduring trade disputes between the two countries. At the heart of this issue was the group's argument that the Canadian lumber industry was unfairly subsidized by the federal and provincial government, thereby giving the importer an unfair advantage. They further argued that this was harming the lumber industry in the US. It's also important to note that the Canadian lumber companies tend to operate on Crown land, whereas the US tends to be more private. Ultimately, the US Department of Commerce found that Canada's stumpage system, or the fee companies pay to harvest timber, was not specific to any industry and was not countervailable, so tariffs couldn't be levied at the time. It wouldn't be until 1986 that the DOC did find Canadian lumber to be countervailable following an injury assessment and set a preliminary duty at 15%. The US and Canada agreed to a memorandum of understanding at that time, which put an export tax on Canadian provinces for lumber traveling to the States. Provinces were able to reduce or remove the taxes, assuming they performed the actions necessary to counterbalance their subsidies, so BC and Quebec had their taxes lifted and partially lifted. In 1991, the two countries locked horns again after Canada informed the US that it would be withdrawing from the memorandum. This triggered a DOC investigation and more duties set at a new rate of 6.5%. Canada was able to appeal the DOC's decision under a binational panel through the Free Trade Agreement at the time, now known as NAFTA, and the decision ended up being revoked in 1994. In 1996, we saw a more agreeable softwood lumber agreement, which Canada partook in since the US agreed to refund part of the duties it collected throughout the 90s, which amounted to about $500 million. The resulting agreement would limit US lumber exports from BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec to 14.7 billion board feet, with escalating fees on volumes exceeding that level. This deal would expire in 2001. To keep this short, there were further disputes around stumpage fees, panel discussions on costs, you name it. Here's a dumb little cartoon to explain what happened next. NAFTA sided with Canada in 2003, the US went to the World Trade Organization in 2005, which sided with them, and the two countries finally reached an agreement in 2006, seeing the US return some of the export subsidies to Canada, and Canada would collect an export tax on softwood lumber exported to the United States if the price drops below $355 per 1,000 board feet. For a while there, things actually got quieter on the lumber trade front. Until this guy showed up. The Trump administration announced plans to impose duties on most Canadian lumber of up to 24% with varying rates for different companies. They argued that the Canadian lumber companies were unfairly subsidized by the government. Sound familiar? These took effect in 2017. Canada was swift to take its legal challenge to NAFTA, which was led by then Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland. In 2018, Canada escalated the dispute to the WTO, and their subsequent ruling in 2020 prompted the US to lower tariffs to 8.99%. It soon shot back up to over 18% last November under the Biden administration's US Commerce Department. This sort of further highlights that Biden also has protectionist measures. Okay, that was a lot of bogged down trade history, but let's talk about stocks as a palate cleanser.
I'm only
The lumber run-up wasn't all that bad for everyone. Some keen investors were able to get the jump on some timber stocks and managed to get some good gains out of it. They had their eye on names like West Fraser Timber, Canfor, Interfor, Western Forest Products, and Conifex Timber and Goodfellow, all of which doubled in stock price last year. The stocks might sound a bit secondary to the overall subject here, but it's something that I wrote about back in May for the Financial Post when lumber was at its peak. So along with this being shameless self-promotion, I think it's also a side effect worth exploring here. The stocks came off their highs in June, signaling back in May that these timber stocks didn't have that much runway left in them. Analysts I spoke to for the story agreed that there would be a continuing demand for commodities. After all, we're still in this Canadian housing boom here, but They also agreed that the big money had pretty much already been made in those earlier months of 2021. However, in September, names like West Fraser Timber and Interfor not only regained their ground, but actually exceeded their previous highs. The reason? High lumber is making a comeback.
That's not my business.
Later months usually present a lull in the lumber industry according to experts, but that wasn't the case in 2021. According to Bloomberg, high lumber prices are back due to a combination of factors like Western Canada's lower output, the US seeing labor shortages in this sector, a pickup in home building, and the double duties on lumber we mentioned earlier in the video is adding to the costs. To top it off, we are also seeing severe supply chain disruptions and shipping delays caused by the flooding in BC, a very grim situation that utterly racked Western Canadian communities. At the time the Bloomberg article was written on October 26, lumber futures were around $732 on the Nasdaq. The day I'm finishing off this script and recording in mid-January, those futures have soared to $1,239. Ouch. And of course, because it takes me so long to edit these videos, the lumber futures dove again in late January. This just further lends to this whole wild ride volatility in the lumber market. To add to that pain, people in the industry expect that these high prices will continue in the first quarter of 2022 due to these supply chain snarls. These high costs add absolute headaches to everything from home renovations to just basic home building, which is so critically needed in this country. One thing is for sure, lumber took us all for a wild ride during this pandemic. If you're watching this, I sincerely hope you're not planning a major home renovation over the next few months because, well, this is a bummer. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe, but only if you consider this an honest day's work. Also, I will see you in the next video. This is Stephen Hughes, signing off.
Skip and jump, I like to press wildflowers. I put on women's clothing and hang around in bars.
He cuts down trees, he skips and jumps, he likes to press wildflowers. He puts on women's clothing and hangs around in bars. He's a lumberjack and he's okay. He sleeps all night and he works all day.
I cut down trees where he'll suspend his and a bra.